In a small southern town divided by prejudice, one man's integrity and a shocking twist will change everything. A hit-and-run changes two lives forever. One man's struggle for redemption, the other's fight against his own biases, collide in a shocking tale of betrayal, trust, and unexpected heroism. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, like, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. James Carter is a 30-year-old black man, the proud son of a decorated military veteran who was once a cornerstone of the community. His father's legacy looms large over him, both a source of inspiration and a heavy burden. Growing up, James absorbed his father's unwavering sense of honor, fairness, and discipline, traits that now define him as he works tirelessly in his small mechanic shop on the outskirts of town. Known for his precision and honesty, James has built a reputation as the best mechanic around. Yet, despite his contributions and steady character, he's no stranger to the quiet hostility and veiled discrimination that pervades the small southern town he calls home. He carries himself with calm resolve, refusing to let the prejudices of others dictate how he lives his life, even when it stings. The town itself is picturesque yet deeply divided, its surface charm masking years of unspoken racial tension. Old brick buildings line the main street, with a diner at the center of it all, a place where the lines of division are subtly drawn. White patrons gather at their regular booths, while black residents often sit together near the back. The police station sits just a block away, a place that feels imposing rather than protective to some. Meanwhile, James's shop, a small, weathered garage with a faded sign reading Carter's Auto Repairs, stands as a symbol of his quiet perseverance. It's a place where he pours his heart into his work, offering fair prices and reliable service to anyone willing to give him a chance. Officer Mike Reynolds, a white man in his mid-40s, is one of those who hasn't fully given James that chance. At least not yet. Mike has spent 2 decades on the force, patrolling these streets and getting to know the rhythms of the town. To many, he's seen as a reliable officer, someone who takes his job seriously. But beneath that image lies a man shaped by a complicated past. Raised in a household where subtle prejudices were passed down as normal, Mike has never fully questioned the lens through which he views the world. He doesn't see himself as a bad person. He's never gone out of his way to harm anyone, but his unexamined biases influence how he interacts with people like James. One morning, their paths cross at the diner, where James stops in for a quick coffee before heading to his shop. Mike, in uniform and seated at the counter, glances at him briefly before returning to his meal. The interaction is brief, but charged in ways neither man fully acknowledges. For James, it's another reminder of how he's often seen, if not as a threat, then as someone who doesn't quite belong. For Mike, it's just another moment in his day, his unconscious assumptions about James slipping by without notice. The town's unspoken tensions are woven into every aspect of life here. It's in the way certain eyes linger too long when James walks into a room, the way conversations subtly shift when he's around. It's in the way Mike performs his duties, sometimes overcompensating to avoid appearing biased, other times leaning too heavily on those same biases without realizing it. Neither man knows it yet, but their lives are about to collide in a way that will force them to confront not just each other, but the very foundations of their beliefs. As James leaves the diner and heads to his shop, the morning sun casts a warm glow over the town, belying the undercurrents of division that ripple just beneath the surface. Mike finishes his coffee and heads out on his patrol, his mind already shifting to the mundane tasks of the day ahead. Neither man could predict that this ordinary morning is the calm before a storm, one that will challenge everything they think they know about themselves, each other, and the world they live in. It was late, the streets quiet under a canopy of stars, as James Carter drove home after a long day at the shop. The soft hum of his old pickup truck was the only sound breaking the stillness. He rounded a curve on the outskirts of town when his headlights caught a horrifying scene. A crumpled car by the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking faintly, and a figure lying motionless on the asphalt. James's pulse quickened. Instinctively, he pulled over, grabbed his phone, and rushed to the scene. The victim was a man in uniform, Officer Mike Reynolds. His patrol car had been struck and shoved into a ditch, its side dented beyond recognition. Mike lay sprawled on the pavement, groaning faintly, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. James crouched beside him, his hands trembling as he tried to assess the situation. "Hang on, man. Help's on the way," James muttered, dialing 911. He explained the accident's location and stayed on the line, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. As he waited for the ambulance, James spoke to Mike, hoping to keep him conscious. "Hey, officer, stay with me. Can you hear me? You're going to be okay." Mike's eyes fluttered open for a moment, glassy with confusion. He murmured something incoherent before slipping back into semi-consciousness. The wail of sirens shattered the stillness as an ambulance and 2 police cars arrived. Paramedics rushed to Mike's side, stabilizing him and preparing him for transport. But as James stood to the side, explaining what he'd witnessed to the arriving officers, he felt the shift in their demeanor. Their eyes narrowed, their hands resting near their holsters. "What are you doing here?" one officer asked, his tone sharp. "I saw the crash," James explained calmly, his voice betraying no irritation. "I stopped to help and called for an ambulance." The officers exchanged glances, their skepticism evident. "And you didn't see who hit him?" "No," James replied, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I was driving by when I saw the wreck. I stopped because I thought someone needed help." Instead of gratitude, James was met with suspicion. "What were you doing out here this late?" another officer asked, his words heavy with implication. James felt the weight of the question, the familiar sting of being judged by his appearance rather than his actions. He kept his tone measured. "I was on my way home from work. Look, I called 911. I didn't have to stop, but I did because it was the right thing to do." The officers seemed unconvinced. One gestured for James to step aside, while another began questioning him more aggressively, pressing for details that seemed irrelevant. Their suspicion wasn't rooted in evidence, but in the unconscious bias they carried. As the paramedics loaded Mike into the ambulance, he stirred briefly, his gaze landing on James. Disoriented and in pain, he struggled to make sense of the scene. He heard the questions being thrown at James, but lacked the strength to intervene. His silence, though understandable, felt like a betrayal to James, who stood there enduring the officer's pointed scrutiny. James's frustration grew, but he swallowed it down, knowing that losing his temper would only make matters worse. "Check my phone," he finally said, holding it out to one of the officers. "You'll see the 911 call I made. I was trying to help." The officer hesitated, then took the phone, scrolling through the call log. His expression softened slightly, but the tension lingered. "You're free to go for now," he said, his tone begrudging. "But don't leave town. We may have more questions." James nodded, his jaw tight. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his truck, his heart heavy. He'd done everything right. He'd stopped to help a man in need, called for assistance, and stayed until it arrived. Yet here he was, treated like a suspect instead of a good Samaritan. As he drove home, James replayed the scene in his mind, his thoughts a mix of anger and resignation. He wondered if his father, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, had ever felt this same weight. Did his sacrifices mean nothing in the face of prejudice? Meanwhile, Mike lay in the ambulance, his mind clouded by pain and confusion. Flashes of the crash and James's face flickered through his memory. Deep down, a part of him knew that James had helped him, but he couldn't summon the strength to piece it all together. The night ended with James alone in his small house, staring at the photo of his father on the mantel, and Mike unconscious in a hospital bed, unaware of the ripple effects that moment would set in motion. Both men were now connected by an act of chance, an act that would force them to confront their assumptions, their fears, and ultimately, their humanity. James Carter woke up the morning after the accident, feeling the weight of the previous night. He had done what anyone with a conscience would do, stopped to help someone in need. But the memory of the officer's suspicion lingered like a bitter taste. At his shop, he tried to focus on his work, but customers who had always greeted him warmly now seemed colder, their gazes filled with unspoken questions. Word had traveled fast in the small town, and while the details were unclear, people whispered about James being involved in an officer's accident. Later that afternoon, 2 officers arrived at his shop, their presence drawing curious stares from passers-by. James stepped out from under the hood of a car, wiping his hands on a rag, and greeted them with a calm politeness that masked his unease. "We just have a few follow-up questions about last night," one officer said, his tone neutral but his eyes scrutinizing. James nodded. "I already told you everything I saw. I was driving home, saw the crash, and stopped to help." The second officer stepped closer, his voice firmer. "You didn't see the car that hit Officer Reynolds?" "Not even a glimpse." "No," James replied, his frustration simmering. "I told you. I got there after it happened." The officers exchanged a glance before one said, "We'll be in touch." Their tone wasn't overtly threatening, but it left James with a gnawing sense of unease. As they left, he caught sight of a neighbor watching from across the street, shaking their head. Inside the shop, James sat down, staring at the photo of his father that hung on the wall. His father had always told him to stand tall, to do what was right no matter the odds. But sitting there, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the quiet hostility of a town that seemed eager to believe the worst, James felt the weight of his father's words like never before. Did it even matter? He whispered to himself. His father had fought for this country, sacrificed so much, and yet here he was, treated like a criminal for doing the right thing. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Mike Reynolds lay in a hospital bed, his head throbbing and his body stiff. The steady beep of the monitors was a constant reminder that he'd come dangerously close to not making it out of that crash alive. As Mike drifted in and out of sleep, fragments of the accident came back to him. The blinding headlights, the impact, and then the face of a man leaning over him, speaking calmly. He remembered James. At first, the image made him uneasy, but the more he thought about it, the clearer it became that James had been helping him, not harming him. The door to his room creaked open, and Mike overheard 2 officers talking in the hallway. "I don't know," one said. "This doesn't feel like a random hit and run. The way his car was hit, it was almost like someone was trying to—" "Keep it quiet," the other interrupted. "We'll talk about it later." Mike's pulse quickened. He tried to piece together what he'd just heard, but his thoughts were muddled. Was this accident more than it seemed? If so, who could he trust? James's face flashed in his mind again, and a wave of doubt swept over him. Could he trust the man who had helped him? And if he did, how would the rest of the force react? The next day, as James was locking up his shop, he noticed a police car parked down the street. It wasn't unusual for officers to pass by, but this one lingered. James felt his stomach tighten. Were they watching him? At the same time, Mike stared out the window of his hospital room, grappling with a growing suspicion that someone might have wanted him out of the way. His mind raced with questions, and one thought kept coming back to him. If he wanted answers, he might need help. But was James the right person to ask? The scene fades to night, both men lost in their respective struggles. James, sitting in his small living room, wrestled with the growing hostility he faced and his doubts about his father's legacy. Mike, staring into the darkness outside his hospital window, wrestled with the question of whether to reach out to the man everyone else seemed eager to blame. And in the shadows of the town, unseen forces moved, their motives hidden but their presence palpable. Suspicion, doubt, and danger were thick in the air, and neither man could shake the feeling that something far bigger than either of them was about to unfold. The days following the accident grew increasingly difficult for James Carter. What had started as an act of compassion had spiraled into a nightmare. Rumors spread like wildfire through the small southern town, fueled by gossip at the local diner and whispers in the grocery aisles. He was there when it happened, people said. Maybe he knows more than he's letting on. Some even hinted that James might have had a hand in the crash. His shop, once bustling with loyal customers, now stood eerily quiet. Longtime patrons avoided eye contact or made excuses to take their cars elsewhere. James tried to shrug it off, focusing on the few cars that did roll in, but the financial strain was real, and so was the sting of betrayal. One evening, as he locked up for the night, James found a note wedged under his windshield wiper. The scrawled handwriting read, "Asterisk, stay in your lane. This town doesn't forget." Asterisk, he crumpled the note in his fist, his jaw tightening. It wasn't the first threat he'd received, but it felt like the most personal. Sitting in his small living room later that night, James stared at the photo of his father in uniform that hung on the wall. His father's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk, courage isn't the absence of fear, son. It's doing the right thing even when you're afraid. Asterisk, James felt a deep conflict between the man he wanted to be and the frustration threatening to consume him. Meanwhile, Officer Mike Reynolds was facing his own set of challenges. Though his body was healing, his mind was restless. He couldn't shake the feeling that the hit and run wasn't an accident. Details from the scene, the precise angle of the impact, the speed at which the other car fled didn't add up. But when he brought it up to his colleagues, they dismissed his concerns. "Mike, you just got out of the hospital," one officer said, patting him on the shoulder. "Let the department handle it. You need to rest." But Mike couldn't rest. Something about the case gnawed at him. He started digging through the reports on his own, poring over witness statements and traffic camera footage late into the night. The deeper he looked, the more questions he uncovered. Why was there no clear footage of the car that hit him? Why had the investigation stalled so quickly? His thoughts inevitably turned to James. The man had been there when he needed help, but the town's rumors had planted seeds of doubt. Could James have had something to do with it, or was he being scapegoated by people who were too quick to judge? Mike decided to pay James a visit, but before he could, he stumbled upon a detail that made his stomach drop. The car that had hit him wasn't random. It was registered to a shell company linked to one of the wealthiest and most influential families in town, the Whitmores. The Whitmores were untouchable in the community. They owned businesses, donated to local causes, and had deep ties to the police department. If they were involved in this, Mike knew he was walking into dangerous territory. The next day, Mike confronted his commanding officer about the connection. "The Whitmores might be involved in my case. We need to look into this," he said, his voice firm. His boss shook his head. "Mike, you're letting this get personal. There's no solid evidence, and we can't go after people like the Whitmores without good reason. Drop it." Mike left the station fuming. He felt the weight of his own vulnerability, recovering from his injuries, questioning his colleagues, and pushing against a system that seemed eager to sweep the truth under the rug. Despite his reservations, Mike realized he couldn't do this alone. Against his better judgment, he decided to visit James at his shop. When he arrived, James was under the hood of a car, his expression weary but focused. "What do you want?" James asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "I need to talk," Mike said. His voice lacked its usual authority, tinged instead with something that sounded like uncertainty. About the accident, James hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "You think I had something to do with it?" "No," Mike said quickly. "At least, I don't think so. But something doesn't add up, and I need your help." James folded his arms, studying Mike. The officer's guarded demeanor was gone, replaced by a man who looked as lost as James felt. "You've got a lot of nerve coming here," James said. "I know," Mike admitted, "but I also know that you care about finding the truth as much as I do. And I think there's more to this than either of us realized." The conversation was tense. neither man fully trusting the other, but it ended with a tentative agreement to work together. They both understood the stakes. James risked further tarnishing his reputation, and Mike risked his career. But for the first time, they also saw a glimmer of common ground. As the sun set over the town, the two men stood outside the shop, their uneasy alliance forged by necessity. Unbeknownst to them, a black car idled down the street, its driver watching their every move. The conspiracy they were beginning to unravel was far more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. James sat at his kitchen table late one night, staring at the dusty flag neatly folded in a triangular wooden case. It had been presented to his mother at his father's funeral, a solemn acknowledgement of his service. James ran his fingers along the edge of the case, his mind drifting to the past. In his memories, his father was a towering figure, both literally and metaphorically. He could still hear the steady cadence of his father's voice, calm and reassuring, teaching him lessons about honor and integrity. Asterisk son, his father had said once, kneeling in front of a young James with a hand on his shoulder, "People will judge you for things you can't control, but you have to decide who you are and stick to it, no matter what they think. That's real strength." Asterisk, the flashback faded, but the words lingered. James clenched his fists, drawing strength from his father's wisdom. Across the room, his mother, Evelyn, watched him quietly. "You thinking about your dad again?" she asked, her voice soft but knowing. James nodded. "I just don't get it, Mom. I did what he would have wanted me to do, help someone in need. And now, everything's falling apart." Evelyn came over and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Your father always said the right path isn't always the easy one. This town may not see it now, but you did the right thing. That's what matters." Her unwavering faith in him gave James a sense of solace, but it didn't erase the bitterness he felt. Still, her words reminded him that he wasn't entirely alone. Meanwhile, across town, Mike sat at his kitchen table in a different kind of silence. His teenage son, Ryan, sat across from him, scrolling on his phone. The glow of the screen lit Ryan's face, but Mike could see the tension in his son's clenched jaw and furrowed brow. "You're still working on that case, aren't you?" Ryan asked without looking up. Mike frowned. "It's not just a case, Ryan. I was nearly killed." Ryan set his phone down and looked his father in the eye. "Yeah, and the guy who saved your life is being treated like a criminal. Doesn't that bother you?" Mike sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's complicated. I don't know if I can trust him." "Why?" Ryan interrupted, his tone sharp. "Because he's black." The question hit Mike like a punch to the gut. "That's not what I said," he replied defensively. "You didn't have to," Ryan shot back. "You've always told me to look at the facts, to find the truth. The truth is, he saved your life, and now you're treating him like he's the enemy." Mike opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Ryan grabbed his phone and stood up. "Maybe you should think about what kind of example you're setting," he said before walking upstairs, leaving Mike alone with his thoughts. The next day, Mike returned to the station, determined to dig deeper into the case. His partner, Officer Karen Lopez, approached him cautiously. Karen had been with the department for nearly a decade and had earned a reputation for her sharp instincts. "You're not letting this go, are you?" she asked, handing him a cup of coffee. "Would you?" Mike countered. Karen hesitated, then leaned in closer. "I heard something the other day. Word is the Whitmores have been leaning on the department to shut this down. Whatever happened that night, it's bigger than a hit and run." Mike's eyes narrowed. "And you're just telling me this now?" Karen sighed. "I'm telling you because I trust you, Mike. But you need to be careful. People who go against the Whitmores don't usually come out ahead." Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the stakes involved. Karen's reluctance to openly support him only confirmed what Mike had suspected. The department wasn't as unified as it seemed. Back at his shop, James was surprised when Ryan showed up unannounced. The teenager introduced himself awkwardly, explaining that he wanted to thank James for helping his dad. I don't know if he'll ever say it himself, but you saved him, Ryan said, looking down at the floor. I just wanted you to know that not everyone thinks you're guilty. James was taken aback by the gesture. Thanks, kid, he said, his voice soft. That means a lot. As Ryan left, James watched him go, feeling a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to bridge the divide. Meanwhile, Mike found himself pacing in his living room, Karen's words echoing in his mind. The Whitmore's involvement changed everything, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he needed help. Someone who wasn't tied to the department or the town's power structure. He picked up his phone, hesitated for a moment, and then dialed James's number. The line rang twice before James answered. It's Mike, he said. We need to talk. James's silence on the other end spoke volumes. Finally, he said, You sure about that? Mike exhaled. No, but I think we're running out of options. The scene ended with the two men agreeing to meet, their uneasy alliance growing stronger as they prepared to face a powerful adversary. Both knew that the road ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, but they also knew they had no choice but to keep going. The uneasy alliance between James and Mike continued to evolve as the two men worked together, pushing forward with their investigation despite the mounting tensions between them. Neither was fully comfortable with the other, but they shared a single undeniable goal: uncovering the truth about the hit and run and exposing the corruption that had kept it buried for so long. The first few days were strained, with silences hanging between them as they sifted through evidence. James, the mechanic, was methodical and precise, carefully tracing the clues left behind by the driver. Mike, the officer, had access to resources and an understanding of how things worked behind the scenes, but his frustration with the department's refusal to pursue the case made him hesitant to trust anyone within it. One afternoon, as they pored over traffic camera footage from the night of the accident, Mike froze. His finger pointed at the screen. That's it, he muttered under his breath. That car. I've seen it before. James leaned in, squinting at the image of the sleek black sedan that had sped away from the scene. It was unmistakable, a high-end luxury car well-maintained, with a distinct logo on the license plate frame. Who owns that? James asked. Mike tapped his fingers against the table, his eyes narrowing. That's Alan Whitmore's car. He's one of the biggest businessmen in town. Owns half the property around here, and his family's been in this town forever. The name sent a chill down James's spine. The Whitmores were a well-connected, powerful family, and Mike knew that challenging them meant putting himself and anyone involved at risk. But the more they dug, the more evidence piled up. The Whitmore's company had been involved in shady dealings with local officials, and the hit and run seemed to be the latest in a long line of cover-ups. The weight of what they were uncovering began to sink in. As James and Mike met in a dimly lit parking garage late one evening to discuss their findings, the tension between them reached a boiling point. I don't get it, Mike, James said, throwing his hands up in frustration. You're a cop. How can you just let this happen? You're part of this system. Mike's jaw clenched. You think I don't know that? He snapped. You think I don't see what's wrong with this town? But I've got a family to protect, James. I can't just burn it all down without thinking it through. James's voice softened, his anger giving way to vulnerability. I don't have the luxury of taking my time, Mike. People like me, black men in this town, we don't get second chances. I've been fighting my whole life just to be seen as a man, not a stereotype. And I'm tired of being the one who gets blamed when something goes wrong. Mike was silent for a long moment, the weight of James's words settling between them. He had never truly understood what James had endured, what it meant to be constantly judged by the color of his skin, but now he was starting to see the layers of complexity in this situation. We're in this together now, Mike said finally, his voice quieter. But we have to be careful. If Whitmore's involved, this could get ugly. People will do anything to protect their own. James nodded, his mind racing. They had uncovered enough to blow the lid off the case, but doing so could cost them everything. Their lives, their families, their futures. Nothing was guaranteed. Over the next few days, the tension continued to build. Mike's investigation into the Whitmore family revealed just how deeply entrenched they were in the town's power structure. Their reach stretched into every corner of the community, from politics to business to law enforcement. It was clear that taking them down would require more than just a few pieces of evidence. It would require a fight for the very soul of the town. As they pressed on, James's suspicions about Whitmore deepened. The man's power wasn't just local, it was personal. One afternoon, while sifting through old news articles, James stumbled across something that made his blood run cold. A photograph of Alan Whitmore standing next to his own father, taken years ago at a veteran ceremony. James stared at the photo in disbelief. His father had known Whitmore. They had served together in the military, fought in the same battalions, and shared the same code of honor. Whitmore's connection to his father made the case feel all the more personal. James's hands trembled as he leaned against the table. "Mike, you need to see this," he said, his voice unsteady. Mike walked over and saw the photo. His expression hardened as he recognized the face of the man he had known for years, the one who had always been just out of reach for anyone who questioned his authority. "This complicates things," Mike said, his voice low. James nodded, a sense of betrayal swelling within him. "It's not just about me anymore. This is about my father. He fought for this country. He gave his life for it. And now, here's Whitmore, the same man who helped cover up the truth behind the hit and run that nearly killed you." The revelation hit hard. It wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about confronting the deep-seated personal connections that had shaped their lives. James had never expected that his father's legacy would come with such a heavy burden. Mike could see the pain in James's eyes, the realization that the man he had looked up to had been intertwined with the very people he was now fighting against. The stakes were higher than either of them had anticipated. There was no turning back now. The twist added layers of moral complexity. James was no longer just fighting for justice. He was fighting for his father's honor, and the deeper he dug, the more he realized that every step forward pulled him further into a moral quagmire. Could he expose the truth without destroying the legacy of the man he had loved? Could Mike truly help him, knowing the personal stakes involved? The tension between them was no longer just about the case. It was about identity, loyalty, and the cost of truth. The days following the revelation about Alan Whitmore were filled with an escalating sense of danger. As the stakes grew higher and higher, James felt the pressure mounting with every passing hour, the walls closing in around him. Whitmore had noticed their investigation, and his response was swift and ruthless. One evening, as James locked up his mechanic shop, a sleek black car pulled up outside. The engine's low rumble reverberated in the quiet of the street. The window rolled down, and James instantly recognized the face that appeared. It was one of Whitmore's associates, a man named Carl, whose presence sent a shiver down James's spine. "You, Carter?" Carl asked gruffly, his tone flat and menacing. James, cautious but composed, nodded. "Yeah, what's this about?" Carl's cold eyes bored into him. "Mr. Whitmore wants to have a word with you." Without waiting for an invitation, Carl stepped out of the car and motioned for James to follow. The tension was palpable as James hesitated, then decided to get in the car, not knowing where this would lead but realizing he had little choice. They drove to a private estate on the outskirts of town, a place that reeked of power and privilege. Inside, Alan Whitmore was seated at a grand desk, his sharp features illuminated by the soft glow of desk lamps. He looked every bit the businessman, calm, controlled, but with a hint of menace lurking behind his eyes. "James," Whitmore said, his voice smooth, almost friendly. "I understand you've been making some noise, digging into things you shouldn't be. You've got quite the reputation, don't you?" James stood his ground, his heart racing but his face betraying no fear. "I'm just trying to find the truth," he replied evenly. Whitmore leaned forward, his fingers interlaced on the desk. "The truth? You've got a lot of courage, but it's misplaced. You're asking for trouble, Carter. I'm offering you a way out." The offer came like a slap in the face. Whitmore was prepared to pay him off, to make the whole thing go away with a bribe. James's eyes narrowed as Whitmore slid a check across the table, the number printed in bold, nearly incomprehensible figures. "Take this. Stay quiet. No one needs to know anything about what happened that night. You're smart. You know how to make your life easier." James stared at the check for a moment, the weight of the decision crushing him. The bribe wasn't just about money. It was about his integrity, his father's legacy, and the moral compass that had always guided him. But the temptation was real. The world he lived in wasn't kind to people who spoke out against the powerful. But just as he reached for the check, his father's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk, do what's right, even when it's hard. Asterisk. James pulled his hand back, his voice firm. "I don't need your money, Mr. Whitmore, and I won't be silenced." Whitmore's eyes flashed with cold fury. "You don't understand the forces you're up against. Don't make this harder on yourself." Carl moved to stand beside James, a silent threat, but James didn't flinch. He stood tall, his resolve firm. "I'm not backing down. Not for you. Not for anyone." Whitmore's smile faded, replaced by a chilling expression of disdain. "Then you've made your choice. But remember, Carter, you brought this on yourself." The drive back was silent, and the moment the car stopped outside the shop, Carl shoved James out of the car without a word. But James didn't feel defeated. He felt stronger. His refusal to accept Whitmore's offer had been a victory, a quiet but profound stand for what was right. Later that night, Mike met with James to discuss their next steps. As they sat in the dimly lit garage, surrounded by the scent of oil and metal, James recounted the encounter. "I told him no. I won't be bribed. I'm not going to let him sweep this under the rug." Mike leaned back, his expression unreadable. He had seen men like Whitmore before, men who used their power to manipulate others. But what struck him most about James was his unwavering integrity. "You could have taken that money. It would have been easier," Mike said quietly. James met his gaze, unflinching. "Easier, sure, but it wouldn't have been right." The words hit Mike like a thunderclap. In that moment, he realized just how much James had endured and how little he had understood about what James was going through. He had been so focused on his own fears and biases that he hadn't fully appreciated James's character. "Damn," Mike muttered, rubbing his temples. "I've got to admit, I was wrong about you." James gave a half smile. "It's not about being right or wrong, Mike. It's about doing what's right." Before they could talk further, the phone rang. Mike answered, his brow furrowing as he listened. "What is it?" James asked, sensing the urgency in his tone. "They leaked it," Mike said, his voice tight. "The evidence. Someone in the department got it out. It's all over the news." James's heart skipped a beat as the implications sank in. The hit and run, Whitmore's involvement. The whole town was now waking up to the truth. The public was outraged, and suddenly, the investigation was no longer a quiet, secretive battle. It was a public spectacle. The phone rang again and Mike's jaw tightened. "This isn't just about us anymore. They're going to come after us both." In that moment, James realized the gravity of the situation. They were no longer just uncovering the truth. They were now the story. The stakes had been raised higher than they could have ever imagined. Their lives were no longer in their own hands. The town was watching, and everyone had chosen a side. And for better or worse, James and Mike were in the spotlight. In the wake of the leak, the gravity of the situation settled heavily on James and Mike. The town was buzzing with news of the hit and run, and the public outrage was palpable. It was no longer just about uncovering the truth. It had become a fight for survival. James knew that exposing the corruption was the right thing to do, but doing so would bring consequences. There was no turning back now. Sitting in the dim light of the mechanic shop, the hum of the old fan barely cutting through the thick tension in the air, James looked across the table at Mike. Both men were on edge, their faces drawn with exhaustion. but there was a quiet determination in their eyes. "We can't just sit back anymore," James said, his voice resolute. "The town's already in turmoil. If we don't control the narrative, someone else will, and they'll bury us." Mike nodded slowly, his mind working through the complexities of what they were about to do. "I know, but going public means we're putting ourselves in the line of fire. You think we're ready for that?" James met his gaze, unwavering. "We don't have a choice. If we don't act now, it's just going to keep getting worse. Whitmore's already threatening us. The longer we stay silent, the more dangerous it gets." Mike leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw as he thought through their options. Going public meant stepping out of the shadows and into the spotlight. It meant bringing in media outlets, local leaders, and anyone willing to listen. But it also meant exposing themselves to the same ruthless forces that had silenced others before them. "We'll need help," Mike finally said. "We can't take on Whitmore and his people alone. We'll have to go to the media. But it's going to be a war." James nodded, the weight of the decision sitting heavy on his shoulders. "Let's do it. Let's make sure people know what's really going on here." Over the next few days, their strategy began to take shape. They reached out to local journalists, community leaders, and activists who had long been outspoken about the injustices in town. The media were initially hesitant, knowing that taking on someone as powerful as Whitmore was risky, but the mounting public pressure was undeniable. James and Mike met with reporters in backrooms of the diner, where whispers of corruption had circulated for years but never surfaced. They provided everything they had: evidence, photographs, recordings, and their testimonies. The local paper, under pressure from an outraged public, agreed to publish an exposé on the hit and run, implicating Whitmore in the systemic corruption that had allowed it to be covered up for so long. James's heart raced as he watched the story unfold. It felt like a victory, but it was only the beginning. There was still so much more to do, and the most dangerous part of the battle had just begun. Whitmore would fight back. He always did. As they worked tirelessly to gather support, James and Mike's uneasy partnership began to shift. They began to see each other in a new light, recognizing the shared strength in their differences. Mike had always been a man of duty, bound by his role as an officer, but he had spent years ignoring the cracks in the system. Now, he was forced to confront those cracks head-on, with someone who had spent his whole life facing those same prejudices. "I didn't get it before, you know," Mike admitted one evening, as they walked through the back alley behind the diner, away from prying eyes. "I didn't understand what you've been going through, James. All I saw was a guy who didn't fit the mold of what I thought people should be." James stopped walking, taking a deep breath as he processed Mike's words. He had heard many versions of apologies over the years, but this one felt different. It wasn't just an acknowledgement. It was a moment of real understanding. "I get it," James said, his voice quiet but firm. "Most people don't see it. They don't understand how exhausting it is just to survive. Every day, you're fighting to prove you're more than what they think you are." Mike looked down at the ground, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I never wanted to be part of that system, James. I thought I was doing good by upholding the law. But now, I see how it's rigged, how much of it is just about keeping the powerful in control, no matter who it hurts." The conversation hung between them, but there was a sense of release, a breakthrough that neither had expected. They weren't just fighting the system anymore. They were fighting for each other, with a shared goal and a shared sense of justice. "We're doing this together," James said, looking Mike directly in the eye. "I need you in this fight, Mike. I need you to see what I see. We can't win unless we trust each other." Mike nodded, his expression softening. "I trust you. I'm in this. For real." In the days that followed, as their campaign for justice grew stronger, their connection deepened. They attended town hall meetings, spoke with local community leaders, and used every platform available to bring attention to the case. Whitmore's power was still formidable, but it was starting to crack under the weight of public scrutiny. The town's residents, once divided by racial and political lines, began to unite behind the cause. The The pressure on Whitmore mounted, and his supporters started to waver. For the first time, it seemed like change was possible. Mike's role in all of this had evolved. He was no longer just the officer caught between his duty and his biases. He had become an ally, someone willing to fight for justice, even if it meant going against the system he had once upheld without question. James, on the other hand, had found a renewed sense of hope. He was no longer just fighting for himself or his family's legacy. He was fighting for the community, for the future. It was no longer just about exposing corruption. It was about breaking down the walls that had divided them all for so long. Their partnership, once fraught with tension and mistrust, had transformed into something more powerful. They had come to understand each other's struggles, and in doing so, had found common ground in their shared fight for justice. Together, they were no longer just two men trying to right a wrong. They were a force that could no longer be ignored. As the revelations about the hit-and-run spread throughout the town, the tension between its residents grew unbearable. James and Mike watched in disbelief as the town, once a seemingly close-knit community, fractured into two distinct camps. On one side, there were those who supported James and Mike, the ones who had long known something wasn't right and were ready to stand up for justice. On the other side were the loyalists, those who had either benefited from the corrupt system or were too afraid to go against the established order. The local businesses that had once been pillars of the community now found themselves caught in the crossfire. Some owners hung up signs of support for the investigation, while others kept their distance, fearful of retribution from Whitmore and his allies. Even the local diner, where James and Mike had spent so many hours strategizing, became a battleground of whispered conversations and cold stares. James and Mike, once reluctant allies, now found themselves thrust into the role of public figures. Every move they made was scrutinized, and the weight of expectation pressed down on them. The support they had gained felt fragile, and the fear of what might happen next was palpable. The businessman Whitmore had not been idle. In the wake of the exposé, his empire had begun to crumble, but he wasn't going to go down without a fight. The stakes were higher than ever. His reputation, his wealth, and his power were all on the line. The more the investigation gained momentum, the more desperate he became. And now, he was planning to flee. James and Mike had received word that Whitmore was trying to escape the town under the cover of night, no doubt to disappear before the authorities could make a move on him. But this time, James wasn't going to let him get away. He couldn't. He owed it to himself, to his father, and to the community that had been wronged for so long. "Get in the car," Mike urged as they rushed to the police cruiser, their hearts racing. The chase was about to begin. They had tracked Whitmore to the outskirts of town, where his car was parked, engine running, ready to leave. They saw him in the distance, making his way toward the vehicle, but as they approached, he spotted them. Without hesitation, Whitmore sprinted toward the woods, disappearing into the dense forest. "We can't let him get away," James said through gritted teeth, his determination clear. Mike slammed the gear shift into drive. "Stay close. Don't lose him." The pursuit was on. They sped down the narrow roads, tires squealing as they took sharp turns, pushing the car to its limits. The sound of their engines was drowned out by the rush of adrenaline surging through them both. Every second counted. If Whitmore escaped now, everything they had worked for, the evidence, the truth, could be lost. The forest loomed ahead, its dark, tangled branches casting long shadows across the dirt path. The headlights of the police cruiser cut through the gloom, illuminating the way. As they veered off the main road, James's grip tightened on the door handle, his heart thudding in his chest. "This is it," Mike muttered, a note of urgency in his voice. "He's cornered." As they neared a clearing in the forest, the headlights caught Whitmore just ahead. He was almost at the edge of a small ravine, and there was nowhere else for him to go. The chase had come to its final moments. Whitmore turned to face them, his hands raised in surrender, but his expression was one of defiance, not fear. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice raw with anger. "You don't know what you're up against. You can't take me down." Not like this. James and Mike stepped out of the car, the weight of the moment sinking in. They had him cornered. There was no way out for Whitmore. But as they approached, James couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. This wasn't just about capturing the man who had caused so much pain. It was about what kind of man he would be in this moment. James's mind flashed his father, the way he had taught him to live with integrity, to show kindness even when it seemed impossible. His father had been a man of strength, but also of compassion. James had watched him face countless injustices in his life, yet he had always chosen to rise above the anger, to find peace through understanding. Now, James was faced with the same crossroads. He could act with the same fiery rage that had burned inside him for years, finally giving in to the years of pent-up frustration. Or he could take a different path, the one his father had walked, choosing mercy over vengeance. Whitmore, sensing the shift in the air, took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "You really think you're better than me?" he taunted. "I built this town. I own everything here. Without me, you're nothing." James felt a surge of anger, the years of prejudice and injustice bubbling to the surface. He wanted to lash out, to take control and punish the man who had caused so much harm. But in that moment, he remembered his father's words that had guided him through countless battles before. Asterisk, the strongest man isn't the one who fights the hardest. It's the one who can rise above it. Asterisk, Mike stood beside him, watching the exchange. He could see the internal battle James was fighting. The choice was his to make. James stepped closer to Whitmore, his jaw clenched, his body tense. The world seemed to pause for a moment as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. He could end it here with a single act of retribution. Or he could hold on to the principles that had defined his life, even in the darkest of times. The silence between them was deafening. James's hand twitched at his side, ready to make the final move, when suddenly the sound of approaching sirens broke through the stillness. Reinforcements were on their way, and time was running out. James's heart raced. The decision would have to be made, and quickly. Would he act with vengeance or restraint? Would he walk the path his father had taught him, or give in to the anger that had so often been his companion? The question hung in the air, unanswered. To be continued. James stood there, the tension in his body palpable, as he looked at Whitmore and then to Mike. The sirens were getting louder, signaling the arrival of backup, but for James, this moment was more than just the end of a chase. It was a defining choice, one that would not only affect the course of his life, but would shape his legacy and the future of the community. Whitmore, breathing heavily, was still defiant, his eyes filled with rage. "You think you're some kind of hero," he sneered, his voice raw from exertion. "You don't understand what it takes to survive in this world. You'll never win. You can't take me down." James's hand, which had been clenched into a fist, slowly relaxed. He was tempted to let the anger take control and finish what had started. But then he thought of his father, of the lessons he had learned from him. His father had always believed in the power of compassion and standing up for what was right, no matter how hard it was. His father had taught him that strength came not from fighting, but from choosing peace in moments of conflict. "I'm not here for revenge," James said, his voice steady. "I'm here to make sure justice is served. And that means letting the law do its job, not taking it into my own hands." Mike, standing next to James, looked at him with new understanding. There was no hesitation in James's words, no sign of doubt. He had made a decision, and it was one rooted in his principles, in the very foundation his father had instilled in him. Mike had seen firsthand how much James had struggled with this, how much he had been tempted to act out of anger. But now, he saw something different. A man who had truly risen above the pain and frustration of years of injustice. With a firm nod, Mike turned toward Whitmore, his voice hard and resolute. "You're coming with me?" Whitmore's defiance crumbled as he realized there was no way out. He knew the game was up. With the arrival of more officers and the overwhelming evidence James and Mike had uncovered, his fate was sealed. The police quickly apprehended him, and as they cuffed him, the gravity of the situation settled over the town. The community, which had been divided for so long, now began to change. Word of James's actions spread like wildfire, and people started to look at him in a new light. The local diner, where James and Mike had spent so many hours discussing the case, became a symbol of the shift in the town's dynamics. People began to gather there, talking not about the old divisions, but about how they could work together for the future. The businessman Whitmore was arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including corruption and the hit and run. The investigation revealed his deep connections within the police department, exposing a network of corrupt officers who had long been complicit in his schemes. The discovery sent shockwaves through the town, and the police department was forced to reckon with its own issues. Officers who had turned a blind eye to Whitmore's illegal activities were dismissed, and new leadership took charge, committed to restoring integrity to the force. But the true change came from within the hearts of the people. They had seen James's courage and integrity firsthand, and it inspired them to take a stand against the systems that had allowed corruption to thrive. The town, though scarred by its past, began the long process of healing. It wasn't going to happen overnight, but the work had begun. James stood at the front of the town hall, his mother beside him, watching as the people came together. His father's legacy lived on through him, not just in the lessons he had imparted, but in the choices James had made. He had chosen to act with honor and to put others above his own pain. It was this kind of strength that had defined his father, and now it was James's turn to pass it on. As the crowd dispersed, Mike approached him. There was a weight in his steps, a quiet acknowledgement of what they had both been through. "You did the right thing," Mike said, his voice quiet but sincere. James nodded. "We did the right thing." In that moment, the last of the barriers between them fell away. They had come from different worlds, had different experiences, but they had learned to respect each other. They had found common ground in their shared pursuit of justice. James's mother, standing beside them, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your father would be proud of you," she said softly. James looked at her, his heart full of gratitude and sorrow. His father's passing had left a hole in his life, one that could never truly be filled. But in that moment, he realized that his father's influence would always guide him, no matter where life took him. As the sun set over the town, casting a warm glow over the streets, James and Mike walked side by side, knowing that the work was far from finished. But they had taken the first steps toward a better future. They had chosen justice, not just for themselves, but for the entire community. And that was the greatest victory of all. As the days passed, the weight of what had transpired in the town began to settle into the hearts of those who had witnessed the transformation. The arrest of Whitmore had been just the beginning. What followed was a slow but meaningful shift in how the people of the town viewed one another. It was during a quiet moment, late one afternoon, that James and Mike sat together at the local diner, reflecting on everything they had experienced. The space between them had closed over time, the walls of mistrust and misunderstanding slowly crumbling as they worked together toward a common goal. Mike stirred his coffee absently, the sound of the spoon scraping against the ceramic mug punctuating the silence. His expression was thoughtful, his eyes distant, as if he was processing everything that had changed in such a short period. James, sitting across from him, could sense the depth of his thoughts, but Mike was no longer the man who had stood rigid in his prejudices. He had seen too much, learned too much, to remain the same. "You know," Mike began slowly, his voice quieter than usual, "I never thought I'd be sitting here, talking to a man like you." He paused, searching for the right words. "I've spent most of my life seeing the world in a certain way, based on the things I was taught, based on what I thought was right. But you've shown me something different." James looked at him, his expression open. He had always known that people like Mike existed. Men who had their hearts hardened by years of experience and by the world they had been raised in. But he also knew that no one was beyond redemption, that change was possible if people were willing to open their hearts. "I didn't do it for your approval," James said, his tone steady but sincere. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. I didn't expect things to change overnight, but if you want to make a real difference, it starts with being honest. Honest with yourself and with the people around you." Mike nodded, absorbing James's words. "I've spent years teaching my son what I thought was right," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I see now that I've been wrong. I've been blind to the struggles of others, to the pain they've been living with. I've failed him in that way." James placed his hand on the table, a gesture of solidarity. "It's never too late to change. We all make mistakes. What matters is that we recognize them and try to do better." Mike looked at James with newfound respect. "You're right," he said. "I've got a lot of work to do with my son. But seeing you, how you've handled everything with grace and integrity, well, it's made me realize that the best way to teach him is by showing him, not just talking at him." James smiled, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. "I think you're already on the right path. It's not easy, but if you keep trying, you'll get there." Just then, the door to the diner opened and a few familiar faces walked in, the people who had stood by James throughout the ordeal. The tension that had once hung over the community was starting to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism. Conversations had begun, difficult and awkward at first, but slowly giving way to understanding. Neighbors who had been divided by race, by old grudges, by misunderstandings, were now talking to one another. They were beginning to see past the color of each other's skin, past the history that had kept them apart, and focusing instead on what they had in common: the desire for peace, for justice, for a better future. Mike stood up from the table, a sense of determination settling over him. "I need to go talk to my son," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "It's time I start showing him what it really means to stand up for what's right." James gave him a nod of approval. "Good luck, Mike. You're doing the right thing." As Mike left the diner, James stayed for a moment longer, watching the people around him, observing the subtle but significant shift in their interactions. The town was healing, but it was a process that would take time. The damage that had been done over the years couldn't be undone overnight, but it was clear that a new chapter was beginning. The past could never be fully erased, but the future was something they all had the power to shape. James's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from his mother. Asterisk, "We're proud of you, son. Your father would be..." To asterisk. James smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. It had been his father's lessons that had guided him, not just through the toughest moments of the case, but through his life. His father had always believed in the power of understanding and kindness, and now, through his actions, James had honored that legacy. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the town, James stood up and walked toward the door. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that whatever happened, he had taken the right path. The work wasn't over, and there would still be challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. He had done what he could, and he had made a difference, not just in the world, but in the hearts of the people around him. The community was beginning to heal, one conversation at a time. And James, with Mike at his side, was ready to continue his father's work, standing up for justice, compassion, and the belief that even in the darkest times, there was always hope. The sun hung low over the town as James stood at the edge of the police station parking lot. A quiet crowd gathered before him. The moment felt surreal, almost too grand for a man who had never sought the spotlight. Yet, there he was, in the midst of a public apology and acknowledgement from the police department. The mayor stood by, offering a formal apology on behalf of the town, stating that the department had failed James in the past, and that it was their responsibility to ensure justice was served. The officers, some of whom had once regarded him with suspicion, now stood in the background, nodding in agreement. Mike, who stood alongside James, had a look of quiet pride. The crowd murmured in approval, and for the first time, There was a sense of unity where there had once been division. James had done more than clear his name. He had reminded everyone of the importance of doing what was right, even when the path wasn't easy. As the mayor finished his remarks, the applause echoed in the air, but it was Mike's voice that soon rose above the crowd. He stepped forward to the microphone, his face earnest and determined. It was his turn to speak, to make amends in front of the very community he had once served without truly understanding. I've spent too many years looking at the world through the lens of my own limited perspective, Mike began, his voice steady, though there was a tremor of emotion beneath the surface. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I failed in ways I can never undo. But I stand here today, and I can promise you all this. I will be a better officer. I will work to understand the people I serve, not just as citizens, but as human beings with stories, struggles, and dreams of their own. James showed me that the only way forward is through empathy, through kindness, and through standing up for what's right. And I will dedicate myself to that path, no matter how difficult it may be. The crowd erupted into applause once more, but this time, the noise felt different. It wasn't just approval. It was a collective healing. Mike, once a symbol of the system's flaws, now stood as a symbol of redemption, his words ringing out as a commitment to change. Later that evening, as the event wound down, James slipped away from the crowd unnoticed. He didn't need the attention, didn't need to bask in the newfound admiration. There was only one place he needed to be. The cemetery was quiet, the air cool as night began to fall. He walked slowly between the gravestones, the rustling of leaves beneath his feet the only sound. When he reached his father's resting place, he stopped. His heart ached, but there was peace there, too. He knelt beside the grave, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers on the ground. After a long moment of silence, he took a deep breath and pulled a small note from his pocket. His handwriting was steady, though his emotions ran deep. He placed the note on the grave with great care. "I hope I made you proud," it read. For a moment, James sat there, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here, the struggles, the pain, the moments of doubt. But through it all, he had never given up. He had stayed true to the lessons his father had taught him. And in doing so, he had done more than just clear his name. He had shown his community, and perhaps more importantly himself, that the values of justice, kindness, and integrity were not just ideals to aspire to, but ways of life that could change the world. As he stood up to leave, James took one last look at the grave. The setting sun bathed the landscape in a warm, golden light, casting long shadows across the cemetery. It was as if the world itself was offering its own quiet acknowledgement, a sense that the chapter had closed. But the story was far from over. James walked away from the grave, a sense of fulfillment settling within him. His father's legacy was no longer just a memory. It was a living, breathing part of who he was. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, he knew that the future, though uncertain, was brighter. The work was not done. There would always be more challenges, more struggles to overcome. But in that moment, James felt a profound peace. He had done what was right, and in that there was hope, not just for him, but for everyone around him. The sky darkened, the stars beginning to appear above him. A quiet reminder that the journey toward healing and understanding, though long and often difficult, was worth it. And as the night fully embraced the town, James walked forward, ready for whatever came next. His father's lessons guiding him, his heart open, and the future ahead of him, full of promise.